In 1996, a surgery took place that was so secretive that the military blocked off an entire wing of a hospital. Well, finally, we have information about that surgery, and we know why it was so secretive. Turns out that the patient was an extraterrestrial. Hello, and welcome to Rope. Did you know that out in the desert, gazing up at the sky on a clear summer night, a person can see nearly 6,000 stars? What's up there? Who is up there? And far more importantly, have they made it here? On May 9th, 2001, ex-military Sergeant Clifford Stone blew the whistle on a top-secret military task force, stating that he was directly involved with crashed saucers and the recovery of alien bodies. He said that by the time that he got out of the military in 1989, they had already discovered that there had been at least 57 different alien species visiting Earth. Before and after Stone's startling declaration, the public has wondered, are we alone? Are there extraterrestrials in the night sky or walking among us? In this video, we're going to consider the possibility that aliens are indeed here and that the world's governments have known about them for decades. And we'll do this by examining the aftermath of a supposed crash of an alien spacecraft in Varginha, Brazil in 1996. Several people reported seeing a strange-looking object in the sky struggling to stay in the air, and then supposedly crashing just outside of the city. During the week that followed, there were several reports of strange-looking creatures in and around the city, and there were whispers of covert military operations to capture them. First, we'll share the details of the two officers who supposedly caught one of the creatures, how it was found to be injured, and how it received medical attention by a human doctor. Along the way, we'll also go over how one of the soldiers touched it and how that proved to be a fatal mistake. And then stay with us for our Fact or Fiction section. I'm going to take just a minute and share my thoughts on this story. And then Amy is going to come on, and she's going to talk about how some animals seem to possess one of the strange abilities that the creature in the story demonstrates. So, this report begins in January of 1996. During the week of January 13th, 1996, a number of citizens in Varginha, Brazil reported seeing a strange animal or creature wandering around the city. And shortly after that, the military presence in the city increased. Later, it was discovered that the military had sent out several teams to investigate, locate, and then apprehend this creature. Then, on Saturday evening, January 20th, 1996, the city was hit by a very powerful and sudden hailstorm. It was one of the worst that the city had seen in years. One of the teams that the military sent out consisted of two men, Eric Lopes and Marco Chereze. After the incident that I'm about to share with you, Eric Lopes dropped out of the public eye, and we don't have a lot of information on him. But this part of our story revolves around Marco Chereze and the tragic night that ultimately took his life. These two men had been out searching for this creature all day, and they were still looking for it when the storm hit. And some say that out of all of the different teams that were looking for it, they were the lucky ones because they found it. But perhaps they weren't so lucky. The storm came in suddenly with extremely heavy winds. It was the type that comes in sideways and in torrents, ripping shingles off of rooftops and blowing personal property out of yards and across roads. It was definitely not the type of storm that someone would be out walking in. Eric Lopes was driving, and Marco Chereze, sitting in the passenger seat, was prepared to jump out of the car should they spot the creature. Because of the poor weather conditions, the car was cruising extremely slowly, with the windshield wipers going a mile a minute. Visibility was challenging. Then, Chereze spotted someone fighting against the wind, trying to cross the street, so Lopes took the car in that direction. When they got close enough, they could see that this was no ordinary person. Its small body did not match its overly large head. Lopes stopped the car and Chereze got out. He later stated that he could tell that the creature had somehow injured itself and it gave him no resistance. He also said that he made the mistake of using an unprotected right hand to grab the creature's left shoulder and then guide it to the backseat of the car. And this is where things really started to go bad for Chereze. He said that there was something greasy and sticky on the creature, and whatever it was had gone onto his palm when he grabbed it. Back in the car, he looked at his palm, and it was covered in a strange slime, and worse, the slime wasn't just on his palm, it was actually underneath his sleeve as well, and when he pulled his sleeve back, he saw that it was on his forearm, and somehow it was creeping up his arm toward his elbow. The two men reported that they had captured the creature and that it appeared to be injured, so they were ordered to take it to Hospital Regional. But along the way, they stopped at Chereze's mother's house, where Lopes stayed in the car with the creature, and Chereze went inside and he washed off that slime. Or at least, he thought he did. Afterward, he got back in the car and they made their way to Hospital Regional. Now, Hospital Regional isn't a very big hospital. It's basically a one-story building, and its location isn't ideal for a clandestine meeting. It's actually in a fairly congested area of the city, surrounded by homes and businesses. All of the business that the hospital gets comes in the front door, including people that are transported in by ambulance. So Lopes was ordered to pull around to the back, where his car was met by several military men. Now, we'll get into what happened with this creature in the hospital in just a minute. But not long after Lopes and Chereze handed the creature over, Chereze started to feel sick. And the next day, he saw a doctor who, not being able to find anything wrong with him, sent him home. But shortly after this, a strange-looking tumor appeared underneath his armpit. Marco Chereze had gotten some slime on the palm of his hand after touching a creature that had been roaming around Varginha, Brazil, and somehow this slime got into his system. The next day, he started to feel sick and he saw a doctor. The doctor had no idea what was wrong with him and he sent him home. Shortly after this, Chereze said that he could feel this alien substance on and in his arms, his torso, his neck, and even in his face. And then a strange-looking tumor appeared underneath his armpit. Well, he immediately scheduled an appointment with the medical staff at the military base, where they removed it. But his symptoms only got worse. Not only did he continue to feel this greasy foreign substance all over himself, but he also developed some pretty intense body aches and chills. And then, on February 12, 1996, he woke up with a sudden and massive pain in his lower back, and he decided to seek medical treatment again. He eventually ended up at Hospital Bom Pastor, where doctors immediately ordered an array of tests, all of which came back showing that Marco Chereze should be fine, and that there was nothing in those test results that could explain his symptoms. He was assigned to Dr. Cesario Lincoln Furtado, and Dr. Furtado said that Chereze's back pain was so intense that he suspected that it was most likely caused by a herniated disc. So he ordered x-rays, and like the blood tests, they too came back showing no problems. So he called in a bone expert, and the bone expert examined Chereze, and he said that he couldn't find anything wrong with his spine, and he advised Dr. Furtado to look elsewhere for the cause of the pain because it wasn't in the bone. Shortly after this, Chereze developed a fever and more aches and pains. So Dr. Furtado, not knowing what else to do, ordered more blood work, a battery of tests. And like all of the tests so far, these tests also came back showing no problem, with the exception of his white blood cell count. It was severely elevated, which of course was a sign that his body was fighting off some type of an infection. But what that infection was? The doctors didn't have a clue. So Dr. Furtado administered 2 antibiotics, penicillin and gentamicin. And that night, and over the course of the next 2 days, Chereze's condition slowly worsened, and there wasn't even a hint as to why. Then, on February 15th, Chereze woke up extremely lethargic, with a blue tint to his skin, and a severely high fever. He was immediately transferred to the intensive care unit, where he was given medicine to fight the pain, and just a few hours later, at 11 a.m. on Thursday, February 15th, 1996, Marco Chereze died. And although this is mysterious and tragic, don't forget, it all started by touching that injured creature, and that injured creature was now with the military at the hospital. Sometime after Lopes and Chereze apprehended the creature, but before they arrived at the hospital regional, military personnel began to show up at the hospital. At first, the medical staff really didn't think too much of it. There was a military base nearby, and occasionally training accidents would happen. And it wasn't all that uncommon for military personnel to show up and hang out waiting for a wounded comrade to arrive. Although the fact that the soldiers were there wasn't unusual, their actions were. Not long after they arrived, the commanding officer sought out a surgeon and he had him gather his team. When the surgeon asked why, he was simply told that they were bringing him a patient with a broken bone. Naturally, needing to know as much about his patient as possible, he inquired further. And that's when things began to get weird. Instead of answering basic questions, the commanding officer got really strict, and he told him to stop asking questions and to get busy assembling his team. Meanwhile, the back of the hospital was being completely rearranged. Military personnel were blocking off the pathway from the back door to the surgical rooms, and when they were finished, the rest of the hospital wasn't able to see anything that traveled that pathway. After the doctor assembled his team, he was told that once he was in the surgical room, he wouldn't be allowed to leave until the patient's condition was stabilized. When the doctor got into the surgical room, he said that the military personnel there seemed to be in a state of confusion. He said there was high anxiety in the room, and the only thing that he could think was that there must have been a horrible accident at the base, and they were bringing in some high-ranking VIP who needed to be there under the cloak of secrecy. He had no idea what was about to happen. Just before the doctors scrubbed up for surgery, the commanding officer physically cornered them and told them that what they were about to see was above top secret and that under no circumstances were they to ever tell anyone. The doctor later reported that it definitely was a threat and he felt like his life was in danger. The team was taken to the washroom where they scrubbed up for surgery. And it was only then that the doctor was told he would be mending a broken leg. But that was it. It was all so mysterious, and at the same time, gut-wrenching. After they finished scrubbing up, they were taken to the operating room.
I noticed 2 armed officers were guarding the entrance to one of the operating suites and assumed the patient was already on the table, being prepped for the surgery. Some of the nursing personnel were going about their business with little resistance from the military. It was also a bit disconcerting to see military personnel armed with weapons and live ammunition inside the operating areas of our hospital. We did not have this kind of experience with any of the previous military accident cases.
One of the guards opened the door and the doctors entered the room. This mystery patient was already on the table and covered up to the neck with a sterile sheet. And from this entry position, they couldn't yet get a good view of who they were about to operate on. And before they approached the table, the nurses came over with surgical gowns, and the doctors turned around and held their hands up so that the nurses could put the gowns on them. And as they did so, the doctors could see the nurses' faces, and they were white, and there was quiet terror in their eyes. And then the doctor turned around and he saw the creature for the first time.
I turned around and approached the operating table with my colleagues. At first glance, I noticed the patient was quite small, and my first impression was that it was a child. I thought perhaps a military dependent had an accident and was brought into the facility for surgical treatment. We slowly approached the table. When I first saw the face of the individual lying there, I was in a state of shock. It was far from a human face. Certainly no face I had ever seen before. The eyes were large and red, and staring at the ceiling with a blank stare.
The doctor turned and looked at his colleagues, and they were all dumbfounded.
One of the military officers of a high rank was in the room. He told us the victim on the table had suffered a fractured leg, and we were to fix it. His tone was commanding and far from a request. I asked him for some details regarding the patient and was told I was not there to ask questions, but to only perform the requested task. He also told us to do the best job we could and to disregard the circumstances at hand. We were also advised to solve any problem that might arise, no matter the nature.
The officer told them to do the best that they could, and then he basically said to ignore the fact that it just might look as if they were about to operate on something non-human.
His closing remarks were even more severe and emotionally upsetting. We were told not to come out of the room until the operation was over. Any questions or requests would be relayed to the military personnel on the other side of the operating room doors. We turned and looked at each other and could not believe this was happening. With that, he turned and left the room.
The doctors, now alone with the creature, took just a second to digest exactly what was happening. When they came into work this morning, none of them, in their wildest dreams, could have imagined that something like this was going to happen to them. After a moment, they readjusted themselves and did their best to shake off their anxiety. Then, they looked at the wound.
It was at this point when we threw back the drape cover that we realized this creature was probably not of this world. It was less than 5 feet tall. It was bipedal, with 2 arms and 2 legs. The color of the skin was a dark brown, which appeared rather shiny, like it was oily or wet, but in fact the skin was dry. The skin also looked reticulated, like large scales, but when you touched it, the demarcation of the scales were not present. It was smooth to the touch.
Interesting that the creature had reticulated skin, patterned skin, almost like a network of some sort. I wonder, what would be the purpose of that? Next, the doctors described the creature's head in detail.
One of the most noticeable features was that of the head. It was large, much too large for the size of the individual. There were 3 bony protuberances on the top of the head, 1 in each parietal area and 1 central. They extended from the frontal to the occipital portions, like ridges. There was no hair present either on the head or the rest of the body. The head was also larger in its upper portion than lower toward the jaw area.
Now listen carefully to what the doctor says about the creature's eyes. Later in this report, those eyes will do something creepy.
The eyes were large, slightly upturned toward the lateral aspects, oriental looking. They were red in color and looked like two glimmering pools of liquid. For some reason, all of us did not want to look into this creature's eyes and refrained from doing so. There was a very small remnant of a mouth and two little openings with a slight ridge where the nose should have been. There were no noted ears, only small openings that looked like vestigial ear canals. The neck was narrow in diameter and appeared it would not have enough muscular support to support such a large head.
Remember, these are medical professionals. They're trying to describe a patient that doesn't appear human.
The upper portion of the torso was slight of build with an obvious rib cage. There were no noted breasts or nipples. The abdomen was similar to that of a human, with the absence of a navel. The upper thigh portions were muscular and out of proportion to the rest of the torso. This was totally different from the arms, which were thin and emaciated. The hands ended in 4 fingers with no thumb. The fingers were strange and different than human fingers. The creature was able to move each of its fingers so that they could articulate with each other, and by doing so, was able to probably perform all the functions we could with the use of our thumbs. We were not able to tell whether these fingers were multi-jointed, or for some reason, the bones were flexible, enabling the fingers to perform their desired functions. The upper leg and thighs ended in what appeared to be similar to a human knee joint, with an oversized patella. The lower portions of the leg were similar to that of a human. The entire lower extremities were heavily endowed with muscles.
The doctor later said that after looking at the large leg muscles, he thought that wherever this creature had come from, gravity just might be stronger than it is here on Earth.
The foot was narrow and fleshy. There were 3 short fleshy toes that looked more like pads than toes. There were no visible toenails or fingernails.
The creature seemed to be awake during the procedure, moving its head slightly and staring at the ceiling as the doctors worked. The team was concerned with it feeling pain, and they tried to communicate with it, but they received no response. The leg fracture was bad, with the jagged end of the leg bone actually sticking out of the leg. The doctor later said that whatever this creature was, it bled red blood, just like humans do, only the blood clotted much faster, and he wasn't sure if the quick clotting was because of something in the blood or because the Earth's atmosphere is different than wherever this thing came from. The doctor chose to use just a very small amount of local anesthetic. They had no idea what our chemicals would do to it, and they were afraid that anything they used just might kill it. As they worked, the creature just kept staring at the ceiling, and it never did seem to be affected by the pain. They cut into the flesh and connected the 2 broken ends back together, and when they did, they were amazed at what happened. The bone started mending itself, fusing itself back together in real time as they watched. Then they stitched up and bandaged the wound. When they were finished, they stepped back, let out a sigh of relief, and they discussed what just happened. They were all very tense, and they didn't know if the creature would respond positively or if they had just killed it. They also shared their apprehension that they all felt from the military. They were extremely afraid of what the military might do to them if the creature didn't recover. And even if the creature did recover, they weren't so sure that the military was going to let them live after what they had just seen. And just as they were discussing the possibility of the military doing away with them, like clockwork, they noticed a strange green vapor floating in the air. As the doctors were huddled together discussing what had just happened, they noticed a strange green vapor floating in the air. And as they looked around, they quickly discovered that the vapor was coming from the creature.
Completely filled with fear, I slowly walked closer to it and approached the head of the table. Without consciously realizing it, my gaze caught the eyes of the being. His eyes were glowing red and appeared as 2 swirling pools of liquid. They were pulling me in. deeper and deeper. All at once, giant portions of information came pounding into my head. These were like thoughtgrams, large blocks of information, over and over and over, like someone hitting me in the head with a hammer. I was also becoming dizzy and slightly nauseated.
This pounding download of huge blocks of information actually hurt, and the doctor wasn't sure if this was how these creatures communicated with each other, or if this creature was just desperate to rush this information into the doctor's head in a short amount of time. He said that the creature gave him all sorts of information about the universe, time, space, energy, consciousness, and surrounding all of it, attached to each block, was a feeling of pity for the human race. The creature said that humans could be so much more.
He told me his race felt very sorry for human beings for basically two reasons. The first is that all humans have the same potential and abilities to perform the very same things his race could. Those things we find so marvelous and magical, but humans did not know how to do them. For example, he told me in cases where there is injury or disease of the body, it would not be necessary to confine one of his species to a special treatment facility, such as the one he's confined in at the moment. He told me that individuals of his race could produce enough energy to heal themselves, and in very rare cases that it was too severe for one being to handle, just a few working together could produce all the healing necessary. The second reason they felt sorry for us was that most of us did not know we were spiritual beings who were only living in a temporary shell, and we were totally disconnected from our spiritual self.
The doctor stood there beside the surgical table, lost in this human-alien connection for quite a few minutes as this creature continued to download this information. Finally, the creature stopped and the connection was broken, and the doctor found himself back in the surgical room with the other doctors. After a minute, the team looked at each other and they reluctantly decided that it was time to notify the military that they had completed the procedure. The commanding officer re-entered the room, but he did not let them leave right away. Instead, he approached the medical table and he asked some questions. How did it go? Were there any complications? And what was the prognosis? Although they weren't sure how to answer a couple of the questions, none of the doctors made an attempt to conceal any information. That is, until the officer asked whether or not the being had tried to communicate with any of them in any way. To all the other questions, the doctors answered truthfully, but to this last one, they all answered no, to which the officer seemed to raise an eyebrow, but then he just went on with his last question. When would the being be healthy enough to transport? The doctors all agreed the creature really needed to stay in their care for at least the next 24 hours. And surprisingly, the commanding officer agreed, but he also informed them that as long as the being was at the hospital, they would be too. No one was going home until this whole thing was over. The doctors set up a routine to keep an eye on the creature, but after what had happened to the head surgeon, none of them looked the creature in the eyes. The doctors couldn't believe at how fast the creature healed, and in less than 24 hours, the leg looked as if it had never been broken in the first place. And then at that point, the military took the creature and left the hospital. Amy didn't find any personal accounts of the creature interacting with anyone else after that. So either everyone else kept their mouth shut or were killed. She did find strong evidence, however, that for some reason it was taken from Hospital Regional to another larger hospital for a quick stop, and then it was transported to the United States and it was handed over to some shadow agency. And after that, well, the trail just went cold. So, what are we to make of this report? Well, the sources that Amy found for this one are pretty solid, and some of you might know that what we shared here was just the ending of a much larger story. We're currently working on 2 additional reports with a lot more about what happened with this case. and we'll share those reports over the next few months, and then we'll put them into a single playlist titled Varginha. But did this really happen? Well, like many cases of this type, a lot of this information comes to us from eyewitnesses. And although eyewitness accounts by themselves are never 100% proof that something actually took place, the caliber of the witnesses matter. And in this case, several doctors stated that this indeed did happen. And Marco Chereze's family still want answers. Supposing that it did happen, then what should we make of those huge blocks of information that the creature or being downloaded into the doctor's mind? The main thrust of that information was that the aliens felt pity for the human race because we all have the ability to do what they can do, heal themselves, control their reality, but we just don't know that we can do it. Therefore, we never really learn how to exercise that muscle. What did you make of that strange slime that was all over the alien and apparently killed Chereze? This really intrigued Amy. So you wanted to talk about how there are similarities between the creature and animals here on Earth, right?
Right. Specifically the slime. So, for example, the parrotfish. It spits out this ball of slime and then covers itself from head to tail, almost wraps itself inside this slime cocoon.
I gotta say, that sounds nasty.
I know, but there are actually 3 benefits to it using that.
Okay.
All right. So first, it has antibiotics in this slime.
Okay.
Okay. Second, it protects from parasites.
Okay.
Right. And third, it has this kind of high-tech feature that acts as a security, I guess, system. Whereas if a predator were to come close to the parrotfish, it alerts the parrotfish and they can escape.
Kind of like its own personal home security system.
Exactly.
Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah.
So let me see if I understand this right. So this parrotfish like pukes up this mucus, and then it like dives into it or covers itself in it from nose to tail.
Yep, you got it.
And it sleeps in this.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds crazy.
Yeah. So of course there's another one. Okay. This one is called the hagfish. And I want to tell our viewers, there was an article on nationalgeographic.com. And the article shows where a truckload of these hagfish overturned on a highway.
Okay.
And the highway is covered in slime. Not just the highway, but cars. There's one photo where you see this vehicle, I think it's a Prius, and it's literally dripping with slime, like you would imagine would happen in a Ghostbusters movie.
Wow.
Yeah.
So these fish emit slime as well.
Yeah, the hagfish has this fascinating response to threat. So in less than 0.4 of a second, it emits slime from its body that grows to 10,000 times its own size.
What?
Yes.
That's crazy.
Massive amounts of slime.
And so that's like, in this case, it was for protection. These fish live in water. The truck flips over.
Right.
They go all over the road, and in less than 1/2 of a second,
Yes,
they're covered in a protective coating that helps them live longer in that situation.
Right. But that protective coating branches out tremendously to where it really looks unbelievable.
Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah.
So do you think then that in our story, part of the story was that the creature had this slime on it when Marco Chereze touched it? So do you think that adds to or takes away from the validity of the story?
I think it absolutely adds to. If you look at what happens in nature here on Earth, I think that absolutely could happen.
So you think
for
that
sure.
might be like an evolutionary thing from that creature? Like if that creature is from another planet, then maybe over time their species has developed the ability to create this mucus for healing, for protection.
Right. They've really just, perfected it. It's not like the hagfish where slime goes everywhere, or the parrotfish like it has to make a bubble. They've just evolved to have this protective layer appear all over their skin.
Wow. Yeah, that makes sense. So what do you think about the story as a whole? Do you think it actually happened?
I think something happened, right? You're talking about doctor surgeons at a hospital who said they operated on a creature not of this earth.
So let me ask you this then. Two more questions,
Okay.
then I'll let you go. One, the information, right? So what did you make of the alien downloading blocks of information into the mind of the doctor? What did you make of that?
Well, I thought it is very similar to what other abductees or people who say they've been in contact with aliens, they say that a telepathy, something happens where they are getting massive amounts of information from this alien creature. And it's, to me, it's so much more expedient than talking, right? Because like me, trip on my words, but if you can immediately download or
Mm-hmm.
communicate
Mm-hmm.
telepathically information, imagery, uh, how effective would that
Yeah.
be?
Like what I'm thinking, boom, you're thinking.
Exactly.
That's pretty interesting.
Hmm.
So, in the last question, what did you make about the bulk of that information? Like
Hmm.
in the story, the doctor said that the main thing that attached to every single block of information was pity that these aliens had for us because we could do the exact same thing they do, heal themselves and maybe control our environment a bit, but we just don't know we can do it. What did you make of that?
I thought that part made complete sense as well. If you look at what scientists have studied about the human brain, and then also look at, what we've done looking at psychics and others who can tap into areas of the brain that most of us can't, I think that absolutely makes sense because I do believe as humans, we have so much more we could tap into with our minds, our consciousness, our brains that we just don't access.
Right. And then you've looked into we talked a little bit about Dean Radin
Yep.
and his studies that
Hmm.
there definitely is something to the mind,
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
we humans just so what do you think? I know I said two more questions, last one. So what do you think? Why don't we why doesn't everyone just extra if it's found in the laboratory, if Dean
Mhm.
Radin's found it, if you believe that there might be something to it, then how come all of us humans don't do better with it?
Right. Well, partly I think because we don't know how. And then it takes massive amounts of time and concentration. And we're all so busy with our day-to-day lives, our jobs, our work, our kids, our family, that we don't stop and take the time to actually work on these parts of our brain.
Right. Just like move, cup, move. It's like I don't have time for that.
Yeah, exactly. I'll just reach and get it.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you again.
You're welcome.
This report comes from several different sources. Some of the hospital information comes from Dr. Roger Lear and an interview that he did with a group of doctors at Hospital Regional. Dr. Lear was a doctor who specialized in removing foreign objects from people who believed that they had been abducted by aliens. During his career, he removed foreign objects from a total of 17 different individuals, and he was able to have a few of these objects analyzed. The results? I know this sounds crazy, but they strongly suggest that humans are being tagged by extraterrestrial entities. We did a complete report on one of his patients, and it is fascinating and terrifying at the same time. If you'd like to see it, it's here.
Can you believe we're in season 3?
Yes and no.
This is season 3, and it's because of you guys. Keep watching. Thank you.
Oh my gosh, yes.